Woo! Okay, guys, I think we are live here from the basement of the ACB building at the University of Laverne, and I have my Journalism 330 Theory and Principles of Public Relations class with me. Hey, guys, can you say hi?
Hello.
You know what, and I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your last name, but I'm pretty sure is it Kubo?
Yes, correct.
Oh, I got it right. So, Tonya, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you. And my first question for you was, I guess I wanted you to start by telling us a little bit, maybe sharing a story that illustrates some of the excitement and challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, how fun. That's an excellent question, especially today. I was thinking, because you'd asked me kind of like a typical day in the life. And I think probably one of the most typical challenges is that in any given day, you can walk inside the office with a plan, and that goes all out the window, depending on current events. So an example of that, for instance, is today with the presidential announcement on DACA. You know, here in California, DACA matters, and at our campus, it matters a lot. We got word on Friday that this was probably happening either over the weekend or maybe as late as today. And, you know, so we shelve everything. And because we understand what our mission is, we understand what our business objectives are, it's very easy to say, okay, we have to respond. This is how we're going to respond. And then, you know, just kind of pull a team together. There was about two or three people in our shop focused on it, you know, writing an op-ed and then pitching the op-ed to, you know, of course you have your like VIP list of places you pitch to and then getting, you know, commitment on that so that we can then know exactly where our placement's going to be when the news does go live, campus announcement, media announcement, the social media plan. You know, none of that was on our radar Friday morning when we walked in, but it just became quickly apparent. And so you just have to be able to pivot like that.
I think that's a great example. Do you guys have any questions for her about any of that? No, not yet. I'll give them a little time to warm up. Okay, so let's start this first question. How would you describe what public relations is today? We've been talking in class a lot about what modern public relations and how do we define it, and there's a lot of negative stereotypes. So I thought maybe you could define it in your own words for us.
So, you know, I was thinking a lot about this because I was thinking about what I was taught public relations was when I was in college, what I discovered it was when I first got into the field about a decade ago, and then what it's become. And I mean, the way I would describe it now is it's almost like this petri dish experiment where you stir together multimedia or digital communications and marketing. But the other thing, and I think this is a big misconception, is it's not all external anymore. I'm finding more and more that public relations is driving internal corporate culture as much as it drives public sentiment. And so you have to be mindful of all of those things. I think social media is a driver. You know, I think of the meetings I sit in, and invariably somebody says, how can we get this to go viral? You know, how do we get 100,000 likes on this? And when you say, well, you know, viral isn't something that happens like intentionally, the response is always, but my kid showed me this thing. Or, but there's that like dog chasing its own tail, that went viral. This is much more important than that. And you have to acknowledge the perception of that, right? It looks easy. It looks like anybody can do it. And everybody with a smartphone, with a laptop, and with a social media presence kind of thinks they can. So I feel like we have to prove our worth in ways that maybe our predecessors didn't. We also have to tie the work that we do to business objectives. And we have to be able to track, measure, and report those results in a way that's meaningful to business leaders because they're focused on the bottom line. And ultimately, that means that they govern our budget, which governs how much we can do and how we do it. And, you know, and they govern our salaries. And then as far as the focus on internal audiences, this is something I've been hearing more in higher ed. In the private sector, we're seeing that shift, right? Where companies are realizing that what their employees say about them in online spaces matters. And people will vote with their wallets based on whether they think a company treats their people well or treats their people poorly. The flip side is, so there's a lot of power in employees that 20 years ago, it was like, you come to work every day, you get a paycheck. That is our relationship. And now people are realizing that how you feel about your job is a huge PR effort on behalf of the company. And there's, a lot of like paid sort of what they call advocacy programs. I'm not a fan of those. I'm not a fan of sort of bribing people to say good things about the company. I believe that you should treat them well and they should organically say nice things about you when asked. But I know that there are companies that do. They pay a lot of money toward incentive programs.
Yes, we were just talking earlier today about Estee Lauder. One of the news articles we were looking at is that apparently the government is suing them over their differences between maternal and paternal leave.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was really interesting. That was right on point with what we discussed today. So thanks.
I'm so glad I could do that for you.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess the next question would be, can you tell us a little bit about what it means to practice public relations, specifically in higher ed, where you are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is an interesting question because, I think as an umbrella, university PR exists to promote the value proposition of a college degree, right? Colleges use that to lobby for private and public funds. They use it to recruit students, faculty, and staff. And traditionally, the wheels of higher ed move really slowly, like way more slowly than they would in the private sector. But I'm in this weird spot where I do work for a university, but I work for a public research university that's only 12 years old. And we operate a lot like a startup. So like my job itself has changed 3 times since 2012. We're in the midst of this massive shift in how we practice external relations because, as you can imagine, for a new university, all those initial hires came, because we're part of a system, came from other campuses in the system. So they brought their processes that they knew worked here. And after about a decade, people are going, yeah, in some ways, this is a 20th century practice at a 21st century place, and that's not okay. And so now we're in that phase where the shift feels very dramatic. So what we're doing here in external relations is we have merged fundraising, we've merged alumni relations. This just happened like 2 weeks ago, so I wrote it down. Communications, marketing, multimedia, graphics, web, government and community relations are all now one big division. And so we're a centralized unit, we serve the whole campus. There aren't communicators in like our academic schools. Like there's no English major comms manager. And
Wait, that new? Did there used to be comms majors?
No, we were always a centralized shop, but it was like a centralized shop of just communication. So web was separate, and web was IT for a long time, and then it came we got these groups slowly, but development, fundraising, and then this idea that internal communications is part of the external communications unit has been really odd. So our grad division has a comms manager, but that's it outside of this office. And so that's interesting because you're not going to find that at other universities. They're way more siloed because they've been around longer. But I would think that a reorg like that would probably take 5 years at like a modernized university, but we're halfway through 2-year plan. So wow. The wheels were in motion on this in September. They did like a little mini merge in December. They did another one in January, and then they just did this big one. And I don't think you get that experience in higher ed elsewhere. And then what I was going to say is what I'm finding, especially with higher ed, is values, because we have a savvy public now. Our students are savvy because they've been plugged in almost since the time they were born. Parents are savvy, and even donors are savvy. Anybody can Google you, right, and find evidence of whether you live out what you say you believe. And so everything that we do, it's like we have to say, okay, does this fit who we are? Does this fit who we say we are? And work as hard as we can to develop those direct lines of communications between our various publics, alumni, students, faculty, staff, friends, those sorts of things.
I love what you just said about living out what you say you are. That's so key. And I think that's one of the big things that I feel like, I mean, this isn't social media class, but
right.
I do love social media. So
I share your love.
I feel like that's something that social media has really changed for the field, is that people can connect and can talk about corporations, brands, organizations without the brand saying anything at all.
No, that is so true. And if the brand doesn't say anything, that speaks volumes nowadays. I mean,
Right.
Before you would just say, oh, well, it's a company. They're not on Facebook or they're not on Twitter. That's unacceptable today. Like, nobody's going to cut you any slack for that.
It's true. Unacceptable. That's the key word. Okay, let's go to question number 4. What are some of the tasks? Can you kind of tell us what maybe a typical day or a typical week would be like for you?
Yeah, well, and so that I think that also depends kind of on where you work, right? Because I am sure somewhere there are PR professionals who know exactly what they're doing every day, and they do the same thing day in, day out. My recent joke is that I sit in a lot of meetings, but I have so far avoided being in a meeting about a meeting. And because that is like my worst fear, like really, really the meeting about the meeting. But I know those exist. Outside of that, I am in a position right now where I'm working a lot on messaging with the goal of being very clear on the objectives of our university. We did our very first campus survey where we actually went out and asked faculty, students, and staff, like, what they knew about our campus, what they knew about our messages, and then what they knew about the products that we push out to inform them. And, it was illuminating at how much they didn't know that we did, but yet how much they said they crave that information. So, this year our focus is really looking at how do we best communicate the objectives of our university so that everybody can speak to that. If you're in a restaurant and your waitress asks you something about working at that university over there, you can say, oh yeah, we've got this big expansion plan going on. Last I heard, there's some dorms coming online next year, blah, blah, blah. They can speak intelligently and they feel a little bit like an expert. So, this week I'm writing social media posts related to DACA, related to immigration in general, because our chancellor is really passionate about that. And the fact that science doesn't have borders is kind of one of the messages we have. Everybody, has the right to an education if they had the California grades to qualify for the university. And then I'm doing communications planning. We're doing a big modernization of business practices, so I get to do the comms plan for that. I know you're so jealous. We have an upcoming accreditation review, so that needs a comms plan. And then we have homecoming, and we don't have a football team. And so, homecoming without a football team has always been interesting, but this year they've really decided, hey, we're going to make something of it. And now that we have all these teams that have independently worked with homecoming together, we feel like we can make something big. And then on top of that, I ordered 200 t-shirts today for a social media campaign related to first generation students. And I have a brand new email newsletter that we're pushing out tomorrow morning that's going to go to faculty, staff, and students. And that's a monthly theme that we're doing. And that's this week. Last week was different, and I'm sure next week will be different too. But that's part of the fun, I think, of being in our field.
So I have to ask, do you work an 8-hour day?
Yeah, well, I have in the past. I've done that, but yeah, no, not consistently. And remember, I'm in the online engagement sector, right? So social media doesn't sleep, so I don't either.
Yep.
And I have colleagues who are I am an 8 to 5. I have one colleague in particular, she's counting hours, and it's hard for her. But our team kind of operates on this idea that when you're a salaried employee, it's really results-based work, and that means some weeks it's a 50-hour work week, but that also means that some weeks, it's kind of dead around here, and you knock off at noon, and nobody says anything because, good gravy, you were here from sunup to sundown last week.
Mm-hmm. That's the nice thing. I remember those days too. That flexibility, really nice.
Yes.
Okay. Let's say number 5. What are some of the ways you think that we can combat the negative stereotypes that we hear about public relations?
That's an excellent question. It's something that we come up with a lot in even in our team because, working in higher ed, not just do you have savvy publics, but you've got really savvy skeptical coworkers and people who have, negative stereotypes of what PR does. And should a public university even have a PR team? I think the first step, it goes back to what I said earlier and about making sure that you do what you say you're doing. Like that because your actions do speak louder than words. I find that with this more savvy public, the increased awareness means that people see the man behind the mirror, in the Wizard of Oz. There's just like no fourth wall between you. There's just nothing. So the first thing I think you have to do is you can't feed the stereotypes. So you don't want to be the slimy, win at all cost publicity rep you see like featured on television and film. And I mean, there are people I think who go into the field because they think that's what it is and that seems like fun to them. And sometimes we have to work with them and that's hard. But, you want to make sure that you operate from a point of ethics, that when there's conversations, I mean, a lot of times you go around the table, right? And somebody says, we're number one at this. And you have to be the person that says, okay, show me. Like, do we have data to back that up? Because we can say that all day long, but what if somebody else says they're number one at this? Like, what can we do to prove we're right? And you're going to come up against, and I hope there's fewer people like this, but early in my career, I came up against a lot of people going, well, nobody's going to ask that. And having to explain, my position is to think in the worst case, best case scenarios. And I need to think about what headline do we want to live with tomorrow? And in this case, it's what headline what tweet are we willing to live with before we go to bed tonight? And that means that I need to know that if push comes to shove, what evidence do I have that backs up this statement? Or what evidence is out there that people might interpret to prove us wrong? And what's our answer to that? So then the other thing I would say is really to emphasize the relations part of the job. Because I think if you focus on building relationships within your organization and with the publics it serves, what you find is that people will give you the benefit of the doubt. And we found this, we had a crisis on campus a couple of years ago, and we'd been really focused on engagement where we were very personal on Facebook. If somebody commented, we responded, and we just had this two-way sort of direct line, and it was a lot of fun, and it was really an experiment for us. Does this work like people say it does? But in the crisis situation, people really came to our defense. When I was away from my keyboard or away from my phone, people would post on our behalf for us. And for us on social media, we still get compliments over how that was handled and how quickly it was resolved because our communities trusted us. Because at that point, we had given them reason to. And I think, once you gain trust, you really have to work to keep it.
That's a really, really good point. Oh, you're hitting on all these things I feel like I've said. It makes me feel so good.
Isn't it great when you get third-party validation?
Yes, third-party validation. Super important. Okay, so my next question is, what are 3 specific skills you think that public relations students need today?
Okay, so I tried to come up with some that other people won't say if you ask these same questions to other people. And I think the big one is storytelling. And you have to be a master storyteller. And the danger is that as we get all these new, bright, shiny technologies, we end up thinking the mechanism is more important than the message. But if you focus on storytelling, you will realize that your number one job is always going to be to tell the story of your organization, the people who benefit from it. So you can tell that story in 140 characters on Twitter. You can tell it in a 1,500-word magazine story. You can tell it on video. You can tell it live. The distribution doesn't matter so long as you've really worked to hone that craft. how do you tell somebody's story better than they can tell it themselves? Because that, I believe, is what makes you invaluable compared to anybody else on the market. So that's one. The other one I would say is comfort with new and emerging technology. Tools are being developed every day that either help us do our job better or they raise the bar to how the public expects us to do our job, right? The ability to edit video on a cell phone has now increased the expectation for how much video content is produced and how it is shared. And people really don't feel like they should have to read something because it's so easy to just make a video. And so, you need to be able to do that. And if you're somebody who's not visually creative, like I don't consider myself like a creative person. I always say, though, I can take elements and make them look good together. Like I'm a really good Tetris player. So if you're not visually creative, you got to find and master the tools that allow you to fake it. So there's Canva, which we use a lot for our social media graphics. Infogram, if you're trying to do like little info charts. And Lumen 5 I wanted to share that with you guys because it's new. It just came out of beta testing. And what it does, it's actually meant to like make video content out of blog posts, but you can put in a URL, it pulls in the content, and then you can, slice and dice your content for your slides. It will automatically search that, come up with open source images for it, and free, license-free music.
Wow.
And it's free if you let them like use their little branded final slide. If you don't want that though, it's like $200 a year, which is still really, really cheap to let somebody like me who is not video savvy produce a video, and I can produce it in an hour. It takes about 15 minutes to render it, and I've got it on Facebook.
Wow. What is it called again?
It's called, let me type it in the chat because it's spelled a little funny in my opinion. It's Lumen 5.
Okay, so Lumen 5. Okay, well,
yes.
I'm definitely going to check that out. That sounds crazy awesome.
And it's like so new that when I first looked at it, I was like, oh, this is hokey, but I'm kind of hokey, so we can maybe make this work. And so that's the nice thing too, is when you get in on the ground floor of some of these new technologies, you can influence how they use them. And then when they go big, if they go big, you're suddenly like the coolest person at your office because you're the only person who's mastered it.
Yeah.
So then the third thing I would say is patience. And the reason I say this is because there is a lot of hurry up and wait in public relations. So, it's like this monthly e-newsletter that we're putting out tomorrow. We started the planning for that because it's a new product in May. We've spent all summer planning it, all summer making this first edition perfect, right? And the first edition was going to go out at 6 a.m. today. And then we hear about the presidential announcement and we go, it's going to get buried. Okay, it's going to need to hold. And there are some people who just can't, like for me, I'm like, what's one day, right? Like it's not the end of the world. And I didn't work this hard for somebody not to read it. But for other people who are like really like deadline focused and very into structure, that's a challenge. It's also, my favorite story is when I was hired as a PIO in 2007 here. My very first assignment, how they were testing me out, was to write this 47-word inscription for a plaque that was going to be posted outside of an auditorium. Okay? Really easy, right? Except that the people's, like the last name was Lockeretti and their first names were just as long. But I had 47 words and I typed it up and we went back and forth like my first month on the job and I didn't hear anything about it. In my world, this plaque is sitting out there and I just need to go visit it one day. Before I went on maternity leave in like 2010, they had me do a final draft review on it. They had been going back and forth on 47 words for 3 years.
Yikes.
And it's like, it's your last day before like maternity leave and you're like, ooh, I have opinions. They're not polite nor professional, so I won't say them. But I mean, to be able to look at such a small amount of text for so long, that requires patience. And the other thing with the whole patience front is there are times you are going to have strong opinions and you are going to be like, this is what we need to do. And if we don't do this, the public's going to crucify us. Or if we don't, we're missing a golden opportunity, and you're not going to be listened to. Somebody who is paid way more than you are, and probably who sits in meetings that deliver information that you'll never be privy to, that influences the decision, is going to say, no, we're not doing that. In my world, dealing with the online realm, the worst thing you can ever tell me is that I'm not allowed to say anything. Like when you tell me, oh, I'm sorry, we're going dark on Twitter today. Like I want to just claw my eyes. I'm like, can you just send me home? Because I just can't sit here and see what everybody else is saying and not jump in. But at the end of the day, you have to do that. I mean, that's just part of being part of an organization. You have to work really hard to just understand that sometimes there's just motions in play that you're not going to see. And you just hope that at the end of the day, you always see how the work you do aligns with the greater good of some sort.
Yeah. Ooh, patience. That's a good skill. I'm going to figure out how to test for that.
Right? It's like, delayed gratification, impulse control. There's all these things, but, really it's just a matter of being able to just hurry up and wait.
Hurry up and wait. Oh, my goodness. Well, thank you so much for answering those questions. I'm going to open it up and see if any of my students are brave enough to ask you anything else. Anybody? Anybody want to ask her anything at all? Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Ask her. She can hear you. Say hi.
Hi.
With working on a campus, how do you guys, I guess, measure the, what am I trying to say? That's kind of a word. How do you measure the success of a campaign that's targeted towards students? I guess.
Okay, so how do I measure the success of a campaign targeted towards students? Yeah, so that's a really, really good question. And that's something that I think everybody is still figuring out. So what I like to do is, first of all, when we set out with the campaign, what's the goal of the campaign? So if we're targeting students, let's say that we want everybody to wear a certain shirt on a specific day. Well, that's pretty easy to count, right? You can ask teachers hey, just let us know if anybody wears this shirt in your class and email us. And you can't make every teacher do it, but you might get some sort of result from that. And you can have a selfie contest and hey, post a picture of us in your shirt and we'll enter you into a prize drawing. And so that's a way to count it. Other campaigns though, and some examples that are a little harder to quantify is our system is doing a first generation student campaign. Now this is really interesting for us because our campus specifically has the highest population of first generation students. And we are number one in the nation in academic success of first generation students. So we understand that the system is creating this campaign because historically in higher ed, if first generation students struggle because there's nobody at home to kind of give them sort of the rules of the road, don't take this class with that class because that's a bad idea, go to office hours, those sorts of things. So, in this situation, really what they're using to measure the success of the campaign is at our system level, they're going to look at application and admission rates year over year and see if this campaign this year is going to does it move the needle next year higher than it has before? And then, their hope is to then over time look at, does it move the needle in terms of graduation rates among this population? So that's a little bit I call that the long game, right? You have to have a lot of patience to run a campaign that you may not see results for in 4 to 6 years, depending. I work a lot with admissions. And so that's something that we've started doing where they tell me sort of what their target areas are. I help them with some PR initiatives into those areas, say hometown releases. So it's a really tedious job, but if it works, then it works. So scholarship winners in that area, we target their hometown papers. And then we maybe do some targeted media pitches to those publications, and then we check our placements, and then we see, do we get more kids applying from that location than we did the year before? Does that help at all?
Yes.
Okay.
Anybody else? Nothing? All right, well, they're quiet.
It was just such comprehensive information.
That's right. Excellent job. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I'm definitely going to tap you again, probably for my social media class. So.
Oh, how fun! That'll be fun. Yes. Well, thank you for inviting me. This was really fun, and I love the idea of using live to like cross miles. I mean, that's the best thing, right?
Yeah.
All over the nation.
My students love all the tech and the toys. So thank you for also reiterating how important it is for them to be open to learning these new things.
You are welcome.
Okay, have a great night. We'll talk soon.
You too. Thanks so much.
Bye. All right. Thanks, guys. That was pretty interesting, huh? Good to hear. Okay.